What's up guys, Andre here, and today I wanted to recreate the Laravel Frontend site using Tailwind and Vue. The Laravel team recently released a new page that showcases how Laravel can work with your favorite front-end technology. The 3D perspective of the different logos really caught my eye, and I wanted to see if we could recreate it here. There's also a few other JavaScript interactions happening. If I hover over React, you can see the text change here, we have this box shadow here, but if I'm not hovering over any of the logos, then it should switch between them. And you can see it switched to Svelte automatically, and that happens every 3 seconds. So if we go into my other tab here, you'll see the finished project. If I hover over Vue, the text changes, but if I'm not hovering over any of them, then that should switch. And it does. So this is the project we'll be working on in this video. So a quick review of rotating in CSS. If you're just working with 2D objects, then you might be used to rotating objects like this, either clockwise or counterclockwise. But you can actually rotate along 3 different axes, X, Y, or Z. So if you're rotating along the X-axis, you get this effect. Just picture the X-axis here, and you're rotating along this axis. So for Y-axis is here. You're rotating along that axis, and you get this effect. And for Z-axis, think of the axis as going into the screen, and you're rotating it just like you would a normal 2D object. There's actually a code pen here, which we'll take a look at. Let's just duplicate this last one here. So I'll go scroll down. Let's duplicate this one. Let's also duplicate the CSS for that. So that should be panel rotate Z right here. And let's rename that to panel rotate Z2 so we can add something here. And let's try to get this perspective here within the Laravel site. So to do that, we just have to add one thing here. We just have to rotate along the X-axis. So rotate X, let's say 45 degrees as well. And you can see we get that perspective. And if we go back to the Laravel site and open up DevTools here, there should be a div that changes the perspective from 2D to 3D using rotate X and Z. So let's look for that. Should be within here somewhere. You can see they're making use of Alpine here, but we'll be using Vue.js. And right here is the div that rotates the logos so they show up in this 3D perspective. So if I actually uncheck this, you'll see it appear in a 2D fashion. So again, let's see if we can recreate this within Vue.js. So we're going to start from this point here. If you want to follow along, you can just check out the commits and check out the one that has starting point for Laravel frontend site. So let me just rerun Vite here and let's get started. So let's start off by just laying out our logos in a 2D fashion within a card. And I already have the SVGs in place. So let's open up VS Code. You can see the SVGs within this folder here. And let's start somewhere here. So this is the nav. And let's just put it right here. Let's say logos go here. Let's see if this is a good spot. Let's just put it above this hero for now. Okay, that's fine. So let's make use of CSS grid and define a grid of logos. Back to our code. Let's say class equals grid. Let's make it 8 columns. Grid calls 8. And that should be fine for now. So if I have items in here, they should be laid out in a grid. So let's say 1. So that should be 4 items within our grid. And there are. Cool. So let's make a card, and within the card we'll have the logo. So back to one div, let's say class equals, let's make it white. Let's give it a shadow. So shadow, let's say 2XL, pretty big shadow. And let's make it flex, items center, and justify center. So when we put the logo, it should be in the middle. Let's also give it an aspect ratio of square. So aspect square. I don't think we need this, but I have this in my final project. And let's also give it some rounded corners. So rounded XL. Okay. Let's put the image here. You can just put it inline too if you like. So image source equals, I have it within my logos folder. And I have one called view. Say view here. And I spelled square wrong. Okay. And let's see how this looks. Okay. And we don't want it to be the entire card. So let's put a class of 1/2 with 1/2. How does that look? Okay, looks pretty good. So now if I just duplicate this multiple times, we should have a grid of cards with logos inside. So let me just duplicate this card several times. And let's see how that looks. Okay. And I'm just going to go behind the scenes and change the logos here. Okay, so I now have 4 rows of logos here. So the next step is to put this within here. So we have to make this position absolute, and we have to make sure it fits within this section here of logos. So this is the div that has all of our logos. I'm going to put this within our hero section here. Actually, I'll put it after our hero text. So after all of this, the logos can go here. So let me save that. Let's see what we get. Okay. But like I said, I want to make this absolute. So it's within the logos here. So up here where we have our text or our hero text, we can make this absolute. Okay. And I'm going to remove this overflow hidden and we'll re-add it later. Save that. Okay. So now our hero text is within the logos and it's positioned absolutely. Now let's see if we can get our 3D perspective going. So let's go back into our code. Let's go to the section with our logos. So right here. And we can rotate along the X and Z axis like I showed you. So that should give us our 3D perspective. So to my surprise, Tailwind actually doesn't have utilities for rotating along different axes. I believe there is a third-party plugin, but we'll just do an inline style here. So let's say style equals, and let's rotate along the X axis. So rotate X. Let's say 60 degrees. So this is just a matter of tweaking and seeing what looks best. And let's say rotate Z 45 degrees. Let's save that. And let's see what we get. And we do get the 3D perspective. So we have to make sure the hero text is in front. So back up here, we should put a Z index on this. Say Z50, I believe is the highest in Tailwind by default. Okay, so yeah, now it's just a matter of tweaking the position of these logos so it looks good. So ideally we want to position it outside of the hero text. Actually, before we do that, let me put it back to the 2D perspective. So let me just duplicate this and comment one out without the 2D perspective. And we'll get rid of this. So we don't want every logo to show in the grid. So what we can do is make some of them invisible. So we still want them to take up space in the DOM. So we won't use hidden, which is display none in Tailwind. Instead, we'll use invisible. So for example, for this solid logo, let's say invisible. And that should get rid of the second logo here. And you can always tweak the position of certain cards using translate. So for example, if I wanted to translate this solid logo up a bit, we can do that using translate Y. So let me look for that second solid logo, which is not hidden. So somewhere down here. It's this one right here. So we can say translate Y. If we want to bump it up a bit, let's say 24, or it should be negative actually. And that should bump it up a bit. So if I save this, you can see this moved up a bit. And it kind of just depends how you lay out your grid and what looks good in the 3D perspective. So again, if you want to see the 3D perspective after you're hiding and tweaking the position of the cards, just go back to your rotate X and Z up here, or right here actually, and put that back. So again, if I put this back and comment this one out, we should have our 3D perspective back. And we do. I believe I also have a scale on the transform just to make things a bit bigger. So on the transform here, let's start it off with a scale of 125%. And now it should be a bit bigger. Okay. And you can see it's overlapping here and also on the bottom. So now we can bring back the overflow hidden on this here. Actually, no, it's on the entire hero container. So the parent container of this. So it should be right here, which we had before, overflow hidden. And now you can see it's cut off and any overflow is hidden. So yeah, now I'm just going to go behind the scenes and tweak this so the logos look good around our hero text here. Okay, so I've arranged the cards in a way so that they look decent around our hero text here. And remember, you're free to tweak this as much as you like. For example, if you want to add a translate X or translate Y to move a certain card in position, then you're free to do that. But for now, I'm okay with how this looks. Again, if you want to take a look at how it looks in 2D, just change our grid to not use the rotate X and Z. So this is how it looks in 2D. But for now, I'll continue working in 3D. Okay, now let's work on the hover state. So for now, I'll just do this using the hover variant in CSS, but we actually have to make use of JavaScript to do this later on. So if we take a look at the Tailwind site, or sorry, the Laravel site, we see this red box shadow as we hover over the logos. So I'm actually just going to steal the shadow here. It's making use of Tailwind's arbitrary values. You can see it right here. So it's right here, shadow, and you can see theme colors red 400. So let me just copy this, and you can see the default shadow here, but I'm just using shadow 2XL, which is fine for now. Let's just copy this. Let's go back to our app. Let's go back to our code, and let's go into our view card, and let's add the hover variant on this card specifically, for now at least. So let's say hover, colon, space that in, and let's see if this works. And you can see the hover being applied as I hover over it. It's not being applied when I come in from the bottom, and I think that's because we have padding here. And when we come in from the bottom, this is on top of the card here. So where we have position absolute here, we actually don't need this container MX auto because it's position absolutely. And we can change padding top to margin top, and same with padding bottom. So now we should be able to hover it from the bottom. And we can. Cool. So we do want a transition on this. So we'll make use of Tailwind's transitions. Back to our hover. So let's add the transition classes. So transition. Let's give it a duration. Let's make it a bit slower so you can see it on video. Say 500 milliseconds. And let's go with ease in, out. Okay. Now there should be a transition on this hover effect. And there is. Cool. We also have an opacity hover. So by default, it's a lower opacity, but as we hover on it, it goes back to normal opacity. So let's do that as well. So let's just put it at the end here. Let's say opacity 50 by default, and hover opacity 100. Back here. Okay, so that works as well. And I think there's one more transition here. If you look at the Laravel site, you'll see that as you hover, it looks like it's moving up. So let's go ahead and do that. That just requires a translate X and a translate Y. So let's say hover negative translate X. Let's say 4. And hover negative translate Y to 4. Changes to Y. And let's see if we get that effect. And we do. Cool. But like I said, we actually have to make use of JavaScript to listen for the hover because we need to do a few other things in JavaScript. So as we hover one of these logos, we want this text to change. So for that, we need a few pieces of state. So let's go to our script setup. We need a piece of state to keep track of what's currently selected. And this is going to change. So we need to make use of refs. So say const current equals ref. And by default, it's null. We also have to import ref from Vue. Okay. We need the current text. So let's say current text. And by default, it should be big idea. Big idea. And let's also keep an object, which serves as our lookup table, which will have all of our frameworks. So I'm just going to paste that in to save some time. It's an object of frameworks. It doesn't have to be reactive, so it's just an object. So we have all of our frameworks in here and their corresponding text. So now as we hover over a logo, we want this current to change. So it's going to be one of these. And it should also set the appropriate text. So let's start with Vue again. So we have to listen for mouse over and mouse out, which is the equivalent of hover in CSS. So for this, we can say at mouse over for when the mouse enters the card or this specific card. Let's make a method called setCurrent. SetCurrent, and we'll pass in Vue for this case. And we also want a mouse out event. And for now, let's just set it to a method named resume. Okay, let's define setCurrent up here. Say function Let's put it underneath frameworks actually. Function set current. And this should receive the item being passed in, or let's name it framework actually. So framework. So we want to update our current state. So current.value equals framework. And we also want to update our text. So current text.value equals, and we want to use our object here, our frameworks object, frameworks, and that will be the framework being passed in. Okay, so let's see if this works for Vue, and then we'll add them to the rest of them. So back here, let's refresh just in case. And of course that doesn't work because we have to replace big idea with our state. So big idea, this should now be current text. And hopefully I did that correctly. Double check. Sorry, that shouldn't be a string. That should just be using the item that's being passed in. Let's give that another try. Let's refresh. And now it works. Cool. Okay, now let's move our hover logic to make use of JavaScript instead of CSS. Remember, we have this functionality that cycles through the different frameworks, and that's making use of JavaScript. So it can't trigger the hover pseudo selector. So we have to use JavaScript for that. So let's go back to our hover here, and we have to give it a conditional class here. So we'll say :class, and we'll use the object syntax. So let's start with the shadow. So let me grab this, cut it from here, and we want that class. So we'll start with that. Let's paste that in here. We no longer need the hover selector because we have mouse over now. So apply this class when Vue is selected. Actually, it goes out here. So current equals Vue. Okay, save that. Let's see if the shadow class is still applied as we hover. And it is, cool. But now it's making use of JavaScript. And it's still there too by default. Why is it still there? Oh, that's because it's not being removed on mouse out, which is fine. It'll be removed when we hover over a different item when I add it to the rest of them. So that should be fine. Let's move the translate over. Let's say these two. So translate X and translate Y to give it that effect that it's moving up as we hover over it. So let's cut this out from the CSS. We can actually just make use of it here as well. Let's paste that in. Let's remove the hover variance. Okay. Let's see if it still works with just JavaScript. Let's refresh. It does. Okay. And let's move the opacity over as well. So let's remove the opacity here. Cut that out. Let's move it here. And let's get rid of the hover. And let's see if that works. So back here, refresh. And it does seem to work. Cool. So now we have to add the same thing for each of the cards. Let me just add it to one of the other ones so you can see it working between two of the cards. So we can just grab this conditional class here. Let's grab all of this. Let's use it for Alpine. So alpine.svg. Let's put it right here. Let's paste that in. Should be current equals Alpine. And let's see if Alpine works. So refresh. Okay, works on that. And it's not working here because we need the transition classes, I believe. So let me grab those from Vue. Yeah, we need this as well. Let's move these to the Alpine card right here, and hopefully that should do it. Okay, Vue works. Oh yeah, and of course we need the mouse over and the mouse out. Why do I have opacity twice? So let's grab the mouse over and the mouse out, and hopefully that should do it. Let's paste it for Alpine. Set current Alpine. And hopefully now this should work. So Vue works. And Alpine works as well. Cool. And we have to change the default opacity to 50 for Alpine. So there should be opacity 50. Let's put it right here. And that seems to work. Cool. Okay. So now I just have to add the same thing to all of the other cards, and I'll do that behind the scenes. Okay, so I have the hovers working for each of our cards here. And the last thing we want to do is have the automatic cycle run when we're not hovering over one of the cards. So let's go ahead and make that work. So we need a variable here to hold the timer because we need to pause it as well when we hover over a certain card. So let's say let timer, start it off with null. Let's make a method called start cycle, which starts right away. And let's define that method here. Start cycle. Okay. And we'll make use of set interval to run every set amount of time. So pretty much the same as set timeout. Let's assign it to the variable here because we need to pause it as well. So set interval. Okay. And let's make it run every 1 second for now so we can see what we're doing. And then we'll change it to 3 seconds when we're done. So let's just make sure this is running. So let's say console log running. So this should run every second. Let's open up DevTools here. Let's go to the console. We have a bunch of errors here. Okay, it's gone after I refresh. And you can see it running here. Okay. And we actually want this to pause as we hover over one of the items. So when we hover over an item, we're calling this set current method. So let's stop the timer here. So we can just clear the interval here. So clear interval for our timer. So let's make sure this works. Let's refresh. And we can see it running here. But if I hover over one of these, it should stop. And it does, but we get this error. Oh, that's because we're calling this resume function that does not exist. We actually don't need that. We can just call start cycle. So wherever we have resume, let's just replace that with start cycle. Okay, start cycle. Let's double check that the error is gone. So we have running, and as we hover, it does stop. Cool. And it should resume after I remove my mouse. And it does. Okay. So now back to our start cycle method. What we want to do is just cycle over all of these frameworks given that interval. So let's remove this. First, we have to get these keys as an array. So say const keys equals object.keys for our frameworks object. Okay, now we have an array of keys. And we want the current index. So how about we say if current index, so it starts at null, and that's when the page loads. So if it's null, then the current index should be 0. But if it's not, then we can make use of the find index method on the array. So keys.find index takes in a callback, so framework. And we just want to make sure the framework is the current value. So let's say framework equals current.value. And this should be the current index. And we need to define this variable up here. Let current index equals, say null to start. I'm sorry, this should be current value, current.value. Okay, let's save that. Let's give that a try. And it should be 0. And I forgot to console log it. So let's make sure to console log it after everything here. Current index should be 0 to start. And it should keep printing 0. And it does. Cool. We can actually change this to a ternary if you want to shorten it. So we can say let current index. So this is a condition. Let's grab this. Question mark 0 for the first case, and this for the second case. Let's grab all of this. Let's put that in here, and it should be the same thing. Let's get rid of all of this. Okay. So let me comment this out. Let's make a new variable named current index, or sorry, next index. Next index. And for now, let's just set it to current index plus 1. Actually, before I do this, let me bring this back. So the current index is 0 by default. But if I change the current to, let's say, React, there should be 1 in the array. So it should show 1 here. Let me just double check. Sorry, that should be a string. Okay, and it does show 1. Okay. Let's bring that back to null. Let's put the next index back. So again, our goal is to cycle through these keys here at each interval. So we need the next index. And when we're on the current index, so in this case, 0, we want to move to the next one. So we already have this set current method. So we can just call that on the next index. So let's say set current on keys next index. Okay. And actually, let me just comment out this clear interval because it's going to stop the timer. And for now, I just want to show the index incrementing. So let's comment this out. Let's save this. Actually, let's put this back. And hopefully the index is incrementing at each interval. So let's refresh this. 0, 1, 2. Okay, so it does work. You can see it's cycling, but we'll get -1 for the case when it's out of bounds of the array. So let's fix that. So we just have to check the bounds of the array. Again, we can make it a ternary here for next index. So if current index plus 1 is less than keys.length, then we just want next index to be current index plus 1. But if not, but if it is, then reset it back to 0. And hopefully that should do it. Save that. Let's run it again. So we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to 0, and it does. Cool. So yeah, everything should be working. Let's get rid of the console log. Let's set this to 3 seconds instead of 1. Oh yeah, so we have to make another method here that does the same thing as this, but does not clear the interval. So let's duplicate this. Let's put this back. Let's call this one set current no reset. And this is the one we want to call here. Set current no reset. Okay. So hopefully now everything should work. Let's refresh this. Let's get rid of this. So it does cycle if I'm not hovered over anything. Okay. Let's just double check to make sure it goes through every logo, Alpine, Svelte, and it should go back to 0 here. So Vue should be 0. Okay. Let's make sure hover works. It does. It should not cycle when I'm hovered over any of the cards, and it doesn't. But if I hover off of it, it should resume. And it does. So everything is working here. Awesome. So yeah, I didn't accommodate for the responsive styles. I'm not going to do that. Maybe I'll do that off camera. And obviously the code is not the cleanest. I do have a lot of repeated code here, but we do have our 3D perspective working for our logos here. We have the cycle working, and we have our hover working. So yeah, as always, I'll make sure to put this code up on GitHub. And I'm also going to deploy this app to some sort of hosting site like Netlify or Vercel, so you can play around with it yourself.